So welcome to episode number 57 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. This time we're going to talk about Donald Byrd's excellent 1972 Blue Note album, Ethiopian Nights. And I have a repress here from a year later, which sounds pretty darn good. What to expect from this album? Well, at this phase in his career, Donald Byrd, who had previously been a bebop guy, who had done soul jazz in the past, who had moved into R&B and disco later on, at this phase, right in the fulcrum of all that transition, is pretty much purely jazz funk. And so what you're going to get are extended, funky as anything, jazz workouts, and that's what you have here. And in fact, this album is one of the most pure expressions of jazz funk that there is. So Donald Byrd was a cool dude. He was somebody who only a few other players in jazz rival for the sheer sort of arc of their career. And so, I mean, for instance, everybody knows that Miles Davis starts off playing bebop, then he helps birth cool jazz. He does hard bop, post bop. He then flirts with fusion and changes his style enormously and takes a lot of other people along with him. That's all great. Donald Byrd's arc is maybe even more varied. Like Davis, he starts off in that bebop and hard bop ferment in the 1950s. He then moves along with the tide of experimentation in the 1960s, and he is often one of the innovators, not just a follower. A good example of that is his album New Perspective, where he introduced voices, which is quite controversial for the more traditional jazz critics listening to his work. And he continues to innovate all the way through the 1970s. And this is a guy with 43 albums career as a leader and almost 100 other albums as a sideman. And so not only is he continuing to innovate, he's all, from bebop to post bop to soul jazz to jazz funk to disco and R&B. He is also putting out an enormous amount of work at the same time. So he's super active. He's super diverse in his interests. He also is an educator. For a long period of time in the 1970s, he's with the music department, actually I think into the 80s as well, I have to look that up. He's in the music department at Howard University, where, amongst other things, not only does he teach music, but he also finds and mentors a group of young musicians who went on to be the Blackbirds, of course choosing their name in part as a tribute to Donald Byrd himself, and who themselves made a major contribution to jazz funk all the way through the 1970s, arguably the best single jazz funk group. Byrd played with everybody. He played with Art Blakey, he played with Farmer, he played with Cannonball, he played with John Coltrane, he played with Monk, he played with Jackie McLean, he played with Herbie Hancock, and tons of great players guested in his albums, and he of course guested on theirs. So when you hear people talk about how in the 50s and 60s in jazz everybody played with everybody, Donald Byrd is the everybody who plays with everybody. So this album comes at a time when he's really delving into jazz funk, and he's getting heat from the critics as usual for changing, because critics like people to do what they used to do, and Byrd was constantly changing, so he had more than a few different phases where the critics were wringing their hands about his latest turn. I mean, eventually he did lose his way, I think, a bit in the disco period, but whatever, he'd earned his right to lose his way. This is really him asserting the jazz funk ethos, and also a real nod politically at the time to Pan-Africanism as well. So this album is thematically, visually even focused on Africa as the origin and the center of black life in the world. This album sounds amazing. It's engineered by Rudy Van Gelder, which almost always results in a great sounding album. It's produced by George Butler, who oversaw a lot of the fusion-y crossover stuff in the early 1970s for Blue Note. It's got an incredible lineup. Has Wilton Felder on bass. Harold Land plays sax beautifully, I think. And this in fact, I think maybe Harold Land's best moment on record, and that's saying something because there's another guy who had quite a career. Thurman Green on trombone, Bobby Hutcherson on vibes. Again, like these are not just minor contributors to the jazz oeuvre. David Walker on guitar, Joe Sample on organ. So he's got an all-star cast here, and they really bring it. Also has, and again, thanks to Rudy Van Gelder, a really rich bottom end here. the instrumentation, all, despite the fact it's a relatively large group, you're typically dealing with 6 or 7, 8 people maybe on each track. The instrumentation stands out, the individual instruments stand out very clearly. It's a really rewarding, it's one of those rewarding headphones listens, if you know what I mean. So the album kicks off with the title track, Ethiopian Nights, and you have this really epic intro with the guitars playing this little stuttering riff. There's a sweet little bit of percussion that starts to weave its way in. You know, again, this is where the production of the album really stands out, and those little trebly pieces just pop when you're listening to it. And then the band slowly joins in and makes this really solid, groovy platform for Byrd. And Byrd, I don't think, has ever been in better form than he is on this particular record. The soloing continues with Bobby Hutcherson on vibes, and there are a whole bunch of other solos on this track, which, to my mind, just get cooler and cooler as the song rolls along. Kind of culminates for me in Bill Henderson's piano solo, which is super, super funky. And then there's a kind of funny little organ coda from Joe Sample, which then segues into Jamie, which is a much shorter track. It's only 4 minutes. The opening track is much longer, and Jamie has a beautiful melody played by Donald Byrd, and it is, you know, people like Chuck Mangione got very famous for playing things which were far inferior to this particular track. I don't know why this song is not more famous than it is. It is beautiful, it's poetic, it's simple, it's captivating. And interestingly too, it seems it's almost as if the whole first side of the album is one piece, and this song is really just kind of a longer coda to the funkier track of Ethiopian Nights. But together, the change of mood from this funky, intense, long track with these alternating solos to this beautiful, almost pastoral track at the end of the side, the contrast is fantastic, and you have been through most of the human emotions by the time you get through that first side. Side 2 is completely devoted to one track, the third and last track on the album, which is A Little Rasty. It's about 18 minutes in length. And Ed Green comes in at the beginning on drums with this funky little opening, which is one of those pieces that percussion and rhythm players like to do, where they start off, it's like pieces of a puzzle, and there's a rhythm in their mind, but you as a listener are searching for the rhythm, and slowly, as he paints the different parts of the picture, and it's clear that it's been in his mind all the way along. But as it becomes slightly less obscure and then clearer and clearer, you're drawn in, you're immersed into the song, and that is a very seductive way of playing drums. Then Wilton Felder comes in on bass, and then David T. Walker on guitar, where he starts off with, you know, essentially picking out a melody, but then starts to lean more heavily on his wah-wah pedal, and you're really into the jazz funk soup at that point by the time Felder really starts to play. You've got Harold Land just crushing it on tenor, another fantastic solo from Joe Sample, and all the way through the rhythm section is just crushing it on this track. Donald Byrd then takes center stage once the song is about halfway over with a beautiful extended solo. Wilton Felder comes in on fuzz bass. Bill Henderson solos on the electric piano, while making another superb contribution to this whole thing. And at the end, Byrd does these echoey trumpet calls, almost like seagulls, as the song winds down. Just an amazing record start to finish. I think it's not a perfect record. There's so much on here and so much that bears repeated listening. I find myself feeling like all albums which are devoted to really, really lengthy tracks, I kind of wonder what might have happened if a little more self-editing had occurred and one more, like a fourth or a fifth piece of different musical inspiration was added in. But it's pretty hard to pick holes in this particular record. I have to give it 4.5 stars. It's an amazing lineup. Everybody plays well. There are some incredible grooves, and the whole thing sounds exactly like you want a funky album to sound. So 4.5 out of 5 stars. If you haven't heard it, listen to it. It's fantastic.